Hi, my name's Tom Huddlestone, and I'm the author of this action-adventure story called FloodWorld and its sequel, DustRoad. And the very good people at Reading Zone asked me to make a little video talking to you a little bit about the books. So I imagine that most of you are aware of the climate change protests that have been going on for the last couple of years. Maybe a couple of you have even taken part in them. Well, FloodWorld and DustRoad take place in a future where those protests have been completely ignored. No one's listened. The world's got warmer, the seas have risen, and large parts of the world have been flooded. And the story is set in London, which is the city where I live, but it's a very different London than the city we know today. It's been largely flooded. A great wall has been built around the middle of the city to keep the inside dry, but outside the wall, in the top stories of tower blocks, and on rafts and walkways linking them together, a kind of second city has sprung up where the poorer people live, a huge floating slum. And it's dangerous and it's hectic and it's busy, but it's very exciting as well. And that's where we meet Cara and Joe, who are our heroes. And they're a couple of street kids just doing whatever they can to make a living in this crazy place. Joe often gets paid to swim down to the old city under the water and search for things that his boss might be able to sell. And there's much more to the story than that. I'm not going to give too much away because I want you to read it without spoilers. But just suffice it to say that there's a treasure map and there's a lot of chases and explosions, and they meet this sort of ocean-going pirate society called the Mariners, and lots more stuff happens. And then there's the sequel, DustRoad, in which Cara and Joe's adventures take them across the Atlantic to the continent of what used to be North America, and has now become this sort of vast, dried-up desert full of outlaws and smugglers. And they have to cross the continent in time to stop a war by whatever means they can find. So that's cars, buses, flying machines, all kinds of stuff. It's a race against time. I wrote FloodWorld in part because I just really love the image of a flooded city, that idea of streets full of water and boats instead of cars, and I really love kind of ruined places where things are breaking down, things are turning wild again. But I also wanted to give a real warning about climate change, to really speak about this problem that we're facing, and that'll only get worse if we don't do anything about it. For me, imagining the world of the story and where it takes place is maybe the most exciting part of the whole process of writing a book. So picturing the world, seeing it through the eyes of the characters. And it's called world building, inventing new places, whether it's on a different planet or in a fantasy world or far in the past or far in the future, like FloodWorld is. And you can create your own place. You can draw a map if you want to. You can think about who lives there, what they might eat, they might wear, how they might get around, what the buildings look like, if it's a dangerous place, if it's a safe place. And that for me is just so much fun. I can spend hours thinking about that sort of thing. And in FloodWorld, obviously, it's set in London, which is a real place, but it's a very different version of a real place. So I had to think about how much London would change if the seas rose and the city flooded, and how it would look different. But I also had to think about how the people would be different. It's not just about the places. So I had to think about, in the wake of the disaster of the seas rising, would people become kinder to each other, or would they grow more selfish? And I had to think about society. Would it become more equal, or would it grow less equal? And if there's new technology, how would that affect people? What kind of technology would there be? Most of all, I had one big question, and that was, in the wake of this great disaster, would people just give up and despair, or would they keep on going? And for me, it's definitely the second one. That's what FloodWorld and DustRoad are about more than anything else. They're saying that even though this great disaster has occurred, there's still hope, and there's still friendship, and there's still a chance for adventure. Because people keep on keeping on, and they keep pushing no matter how bad things get. So I hope that you'll join me on this adventure. I hope that you'll come away with Cara and Joe and see what they get up to, and I hope you'll read the book and I hope you'll really enjoy it. And so the good people at Reading Zone also asked me to read a little extract from the book to give you a flavour of what FloodWorld is about. And I've chosen a little piece from the very start of the book, where Joe has been sent down to the sunken city, the city beneath the waves, flooded old London, to find something for his boss, who's a kind of ruffian character called Culpepper, find something that he can sell. So Joe's got an oxygen tank on his back and a mask, and he's got a wind-up torch, and he's just started swimming down there. The houses here were low, a maze of narrow terraces and algae-stained roofs. Joe saw shattered windows, rotting curtains waving in the current, but there were no cars. They must have been dragged up for scrap years ago. This whole area had been picked clean. He scanned the nearby buildings for the word Culpepper had made him memorize. A sign said post office, another supermarket. Then he saw it, cinema. It was a squat brick building, the entrance just a gaping, rust-edged hole. Joe swam closer, taking hold of the steel frame. He peered inside. The carpets, once red, were almost black with silt. Joe tugged the torch from his pocket, winding the crank 5 times, then flicking the switch. Shapes emerged from the gloom, rotted chairs and a smooth fiberglass counter. The walls were lined with pictures, sealed in grimy frames. Joe wiped one clean and saw a woman holding a gun in her hand. He wondered what kind of place it had been, this cinema. Silver winked as a school of sprats darted out of the light. Doors branched left and right, blocked with fallen debris. But in the far corner, a flight of steps led up to a larger door. A sign read, Screen 1, just as Culpepper had said. The hinges were stiff, but a few cautious tugs pulled the door wide enough for Joe to squeeze through. The room inside was dark and cavernous. He felt his heartbeat quicken. It wouldn't take much, a rotted roof beam or a rusted girder, and he'd be trapped, crushed in the rubble or buried alive until his air ran out. It wasn't uncommon these days. With each passing year they had to swim deeper and search harder to find anything worth bringing up. This job was getting riskier all the time. The room was full of chairs, all facing the opposite way. The far wall was perfectly flat and perfectly white, and Joe wondered why people would come in here to sit and stare at nothing. He started forward, but as he did so, something scraped against his arm, and he jerked round in surprise. Empty eye sockets stared back, white teeth grinning from a face picked clean. The air exploded from Joe's lungs, the torch dropping from his hand. It tumbled down into the silt, and the room was plunged into darkness. Joe felt the skeleton drift alongside, bony fingers scraping at his scalp. He'd seen bodies before, human and animal, but he'd never been touched by one. He took an urgent breath. The torch glimmered below him and he scrabbled for it, taking hold just as the bulb died. Lucky, he thought. A few more seconds, and he might never have found it. He wound the crank, the beam flashing across white bone. He shut his eyes and gave a shove. Limbs spun loose, ribs tumbling into the darkness. He wiped his hands on his shorts, knowing it was a ridiculous thing to do. He almost laughed, then he gathered himself. He had to keep going. To find out what happens next, you'll have to read FloodWorld. Thanks very much for listening.